April 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above France. Through the thin canopy of a Focke-Wulf 190, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermsen could see them climbing below, 16 enormous American fighters glinting in the pale morning sun. Their shape seemed absurd, wide bellies, stubby wings, and propellers that looked far too large. He laughed into his oxygen mask. Flying milk bottles, he called them, slow, clumsy, and doomed. Around him, his fellow Luftwaffe pilots shared the joke, but as the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts clawed their way upward, their engines bellowed with a sound no one in Europe had heard before, deep, mechanical, relentless. The laughter over the radio drifted into static. None of the German aces circling above knew that this ungainly machine, this American brute of metal and horsepower, would soon dominate their skies. Within 2 years, the laughter would vanish, drowned out by the rhythm of 850 caliber guns. That morning over France marked the beginning of a reckoning. When the P-47 Thunderbolt first appeared, the air over Europe belonged to the Germans. For nearly 4 years, the Luftwaffe had written the rules of aerial warfare. Its aces had fought from Warsaw to London, from the Russian steppe to the Channel coast. They had learned survival the hard way, through hundreds of missions and thousands of kills. In 1943, a young American pilot entering combat faced opponents who had already survived everything war could throw at them. The United States Army Air Forces, newly formed and ambitious, were still learning how to fight in the European sky. American bombers were arriving in growing numbers, but their escort fighters were few and limited in range. The British Spitfire could not fly deep enough to guard the heavy bombers to their targets. The U.S. needed something new, a fighter that could reach high, stay long, and survive punishment. That requirement landed on the desk of Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer working for Republic Aviation on Long Island. In the summer of 1940, while France fell and German fighters swept across Europe, Kartveli received an urgent telegram from the U.S. Army Air Corps. The new war demanded a high-altitude interceptor that could match or surpass anything in German service. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190. Kartveli's answer defied convention. Rather than chasing the Luftwaffe's obsession with light, nimble fighters, he chose a different philosophy: power, endurance, and survivability. The result was a machine that looked almost monstrous on the drawing board. A single-engine fighter the size of a light bomber, wrapped around one of the most powerful engines ever built, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial capable of 2,000 horsepower. When the prototype XP-47B rolled out of the Republic hangar in May 1941, engineers joked it looked pregnant. With its massive fuselage housing a turbo supercharger system and ductwork running the length of the aircraft, it weighed nearly 10,000 pounds empty, half again as much as most fighters of the day. Some test pilots doubted it would even fly. Then it did. The first test flight stunned observers. The huge machine climbed smoothly into the air, its supercharger feeding the engine with compressed air even at 27,000 feet, altitudes where most fighters gasped. The cockpit was spacious and comfortable, the controls heavy but responsive, and the sound, a low, resonant thunder, was unlike anything else in the sky. The Army ordered it into production almost immediately. The new fighter would be called the Thunderbolt, but designing power on paper was one thing. Mastering it in combat would be another. By 1942, as America mobilized in earnest, hundreds of P-47s began rolling out of factories in Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana. On airfields across the United States, pilots climbed into the cockpit of the new fighter and discovered a beast that demanded respect. It was fast, but dangerously so. On takeoff, the massive propeller torque could flip the aircraft onto its back. In dives, it accelerated into the unknown realm of compressibility, where air resistance locked the controls solid. During landings, it tended to ground loop, shearing off landing gear. Training accidents multiplied. Between autumn 1942 and early 1943, one group alone lost more aircraft in training than they would later lose to enemy fire. Pilots cursed the Thunderbolt as a killer, yet those who mastered it began to sense its potential. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, an Oklahoma farm boy turned pilot, later recalled his first flight. It felt like strapping yourself to a locomotive. The plane didn't so much fly as surge forward, unstoppable, unbending, alive with brute force. As these new American fighters prepared to enter European combat, German air superiority remained almost unquestioned. The Fu-190A reigned as the best all-round fighter in the world, fast, maneuverable, deadly. Luftwaffe pilots considered their dominance permanent. In the spring of 1943, that illusion would meet a challenger. The first P-47C Thunderbolts were shipped to England, assigned to the newly formed 4th Fighter Group, composed largely of former Eagle Squadron pilots who had already flown Spitfires with the RAF. Their mission: escort the bombers deeper over occupied Europe than any American fighter had yet gone. To the Germans, it looked laughable, a 7-ton machine trying to climb into their thin air kingdom. To the Americans, it was the start of a new experiment in air power. The stage was set. The Luftwaffe's veterans watched from above. The rookies below trusted in horsepower and hope. What happened next would redefine air combat and prove that power could be a weapon all its own. When the P-47 Thunderbolt first met the Luftwaffe in battle, it seemed to confirm every German joke. The first operations began in April 1943, with small formations escorting U.S. bombers over northern France. The Thunderbolt was enormous, a lumbering presence compared to the sleek FW-190s and Bf-109s that darted through the thin air. German pilots, confident from years of dominance, saw easy prey. Their radio chatter was mocking. Flying milk bottles, they called them. Too slow to climb, too heavy to turn, and far too obvious against the bright sky. To the Luftwaffe, the Americans were bringing tractors to a knife fight. The first month of combat seemed to prove them right. 14 Thunderbolts were lost for only 3 confirmed kills. The British Royal Air Force observed the results in silence, their Spitfire squadrons whispering that the Americans had made a mistake. "A fighter should dance," one RAF officer said. "The P-47 only stomps." But what German intelligence failed to notice, and what American engineers were only beginning to understand, was that this metal brute could take punishment like no aircraft before it. Reports began filtering back from the front. A Thunderbolt returned from a May 1943 mission riddled with holes, over 100 from machine gun fire, and 21 from cannon shells. Yet it landed. Another limped home on half an engine, its controls shredded, the pilot unhurt. The secret was in its radial engine, air-cooled, rugged, without the fragile radiators or coolant lines that doomed liquid-cooled fighters after just a few hits. The Thunderbolt didn't just survive, it refused to die. Still in those early months, the pilots of the 56th Fighter Group, America's first P-47 unit in Europe, fought a lonely uphill battle. They were learning in real time, and often the hard way that survival in the Thunderbolt meant unlearning everything they'd been taught about dogfighting. The traditional turning, fight, the elegant spirals of the Spitfire and Messerschmitt were suicide in a 7-ton aircraft. Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commanding the 56th, recognized it before anyone else. "You don't turn with them," he told his men. "You hit them and climb away." Zemke was inventing what would later be known as energy fighting, trading speed and altitude instead of maneuver. The Thunderbolt, he realized, was not a duelist's blade. It was a hammer. Meanwhile, on the German side, arrogance hardened into routine. Veterans like Joseph Pips Priller, commander of Jagdgeschwader 26, dismissed the American fighter as a joke. His first report to headquarters was cutting. "The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow." He wasn't alone. The Luftwaffe's pilots believed they were facing an inferior enemy with superior numbers. And for a time, they were right. But in war, the truth has a way of emerging from wreckage. Each time a P-47 went down, the engineers studied what had failed and what hadn't. They found bullet paths through armor plate that had stopped just short of fuel tanks, propeller blades nicked but intact, engines that still turned despite shattered cowlings. The Thunderbolt was not a refinement. It was industrial power shaped into wings. By the summer of 1943, production was climbing. More pilots, more aircraft, more training hours. American factories were delivering machines faster than Germany could shoot them down. Slowly, the new tactics began to take hold. Instead of dueling with the Luftwaffe, Thunderbolt pilots climbed high. 25,000, 30,000 feet, using their turbo-supercharged engines to reach altitudes where German fighters struggled for air. When enemy formations appeared below, the P-47s rolled inverted and dove, their weight turning gravity itself into a weapon. A German pilot once described the experience. They came down like thunder. One moment the sky was clear, the next it was filled with tracers. You couldn't turn, couldn't climb. There was just the roar, and the bullets. The Americans called it boom and zoom. The Luftwaffe began calling it something else. Death from above. Still in early summer 1943, these were lessons written in blood. Rookie pilots were learning to survive against opponents who had already seen 4 years of war. Many wouldn't make it home. But the survivors, men like Zemke, Schilling, and Johnson, were shaping something the Germans had not yet understood. It wasn't just another fighter they faced. It was the first sign of a new kind of war, one driven by industry, endurance, and the unstoppable rhythm of 8 heavy guns. And soon, one pilot's story would reveal just how unstoppable the Thunderbolt truly was. No aircraft of the Second World War demanded more from its pilots than the P-47 Thunderbolt. It was not a plane you simply flew. It was a machine you wrestled with, mastered, and eventually trusted with your life. At Bridgeport, Connecticut, where the 56th Fighter Group first trained, the learning curve was brutal. The Thunderbolt's power came at a price. Torque so fierce that careless throttle work could flip the plane during takeoff, and dive speeds that pushed pilots to the edge of consciousness. Between late 1942 and early 1943, dozens of young Americans died in peacetime skies, victims of a fighter that punished hesitation. "It's too much airplane for a boy," one instructor admitted. But those who endured the training began to discover what the Republic engineers had promised. A machine that could climb into the stratosphere and still bring you home with half its structure shot away. The pilots nicknamed it the Jug. Some said it stood for juggernaut, others for jug of milk, mocking its bulbous fuselage. But within months the word carried a different weight. It meant survival. When a P-47 went down in Europe, it often left behind no wreckage, only a crater. But when it limped back, smoking and torn, the men who climbed out were living proof that the era of fragile, lightweight fighters was ending. The Thunderbolt was, above all, an engineering triumph. Its heart, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp, was one of the most powerful radial engines ever built. But its secret weapon was hidden behind the cockpit, a turbo supercharger the size of a small car, fed by a labyrinth of ducts that ran the length of the fuselage. At 30,000 feet, where German fighters began to gasp for oxygen, the P-47 could still produce full sea-level power. That single technological leap changed the rules of high-altitude warfare. It was not elegance that made the Thunderbolt great. It was redundancy. Every critical system was doubled, armored, and protected. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, the cockpit surrounded by steel plating and bullet-resistant glass. Even the propeller, over 13 feet in diameter, was designed to bite the thin air at altitudes no other fighter could reach. German pilots, used to seeing opponents disintegrate under cannon fire, found the P-47 frighteningly durable. They reported firing entire ammunition belts without bringing one down. In post-war interviews, Luftwaffe ace Heinz Knoke admitted that shooting at a Thunderbolt felt like shooting at an iron door. Every inch of the aircraft reflected American industrial philosophy. Massive, reliable, overbuilt, it wasn't meant to win duels. It was meant to survive wars. The Thunderbolt's pilots entered combat flying the wrong kind of war. In the spring of 1943, they tried to fight like Spitfire or Messerschmitt pilots, tight turns, quick reversals, close-in shooting. The results were disastrous. The Thunderbolt could not outturn anything in German service. Major Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, understood before anyone else that survival meant breaking the rules. "Don't turn with them," he told his men. "Dive through them." Zemke's approach was pure physics. The P-47's great weight gave it enormous potential energy in a dive. From 30,000 feet, it could exceed 550 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter. The trick was to use that speed as a weapon, dive, fire, and climb away before the enemy could react. The pilots began calling it boom and zoom. It became the Thunderbolt's signature tactic. The Luftwaffe soon learned to fear the vertical attack. A formation of P-47s would appear high above, invisible against the sun, then plunge as one. In seconds, 8 heavy guns per aircraft would fill the air with tracer fire, and anything caught in that cone of destruction simply vanished. The Germans, who had once mocked the flying milk bottle, now called it Donnerschlag, the thunderclap. These new tactics reversed the balance of power. At high altitude, the Thunderbolt ruled the sky. The Luftwaffe could no longer climb above it, and in a dive, nothing could catch it. By mid-1943, the laughter on German radios had stopped. In its place came silence, and then sometimes panic. The Americans were no longer chasing the Luftwaffe. They were hunting it. Nothing in the European skies matched the P-47's firepower. Its 850 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing, gave it a combined rate of fire of nearly 6,000 rounds per minute. Each gun carried 425 rounds, a total of 3,400 bullets, a storm of metal that could slice through any aircraft in existence. At the standard convergence range of 300 yards, those 8 barrels created a deadly zone barely 6 feet wide. Anything that entered it ceased to exist within seconds. A German ace once described the sight. It was like flying into a wall of fire. While Luftwaffe aircraft carried heavier 20mm cannon, their ammunition was limited, often just 120 rounds per gun. The Americans could hold the trigger for 30 continuous seconds, an eternity in air combat. Their belts were loaded in sequence, armor-piercing incendiary, tracer, and ball rounds designed to not only penetrate but ignite. When the Browning spoke, aircraft didn't just fall, they exploded. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, one of the first American aces in Europe, compared it to hunting with artillery. "You didn't shoot to hit him," he said. "You shot to erase him." The Thunderbolt's gunnery was more than firepower. It was precision manufacturing on a national scale. The Lake City Arsenal in Missouri was producing tens of millions of 50 caliber rounds monthly by 1944, each engineered to feed flawlessly through the synchronized mechanisms of the Browning guns. It was industry turned into mathematics, destruction by the numbers. Every German pilot who faced a P-47 fought more than a machine. He fought a factory. The Republic Aviation Plant at Farmingdale, Long Island, was operating around the clock by 1943, producing 1 Thunderbolt every 60 minutes. Across the Atlantic, Germany was already straining to replace its losses. The Luftwaffe could no longer rebuild what the Americans could replace overnight. For every aircraft Germany lost, the United States built 10. For every pilot the Luftwaffe buried, America trained 3 more. The Thunderbolt became the perfect expression of that imbalance, a weapon that embodied not elegance but abundance. The difference was philosophical. German engineering sought refinement. The lightest airframe, the perfect balance, the most efficient weapon. American industry built for endurance. The Thunderbolt's skin was thicker, its frame heavier, its engine far more complex. But it could be manufactured in thousands, maintained in mud, and flown by pilots barely out of training. The Luftwaffe's ace culture, forged in the early victories of 1939 and 1940, depended on individual mastery. The Americans replaced that with collective efficiency, standardized training, replaceable parts, and overwhelming logistics. A German officer captured in late 1944 summarized the shift with weary honesty. "We used to fight men. Now we fight factories." By the autumn of 1943, the German High Command had begun to take the Thunderbolt seriously. Intelligence officers gathered reports from frontline squadrons describing a new American fighter that could absorb entire cannon belts and still return to base. Some dismissed the stories as exaggeration, until wreckage told the truth. Engineers examined the remains of downed P-47s and found armor plating thicker than anything on their own fighters. They noted the strength of its construction. Massive wing spars, double control cables, self-sealing fuel tanks, layers of redundancy everywhere. Luftwaffe ace Joseph Priller, once a mocker of the flying milk bottle, admitted to fellow officers that the Americans had built something extraordinary. "It's ugly," he said, "but it refuses to die." By the end of 1943, the German reports changed tone entirely. What had once been listed as inferior in performance was now described as dangerous at altitude, nearly unshootable, devastating in firepower. Even Adolf Galland, the legendary General der Jagdflieger, would later acknowledge the truth. We underestimated the Americans. They built a bomber and called it a fighter, and it worked. The laughter of April 1943 was gone. In its place came a kind of grim respect and growing fear. For the Luftwaffe, the P-47 was no longer just another opponent. It was a signal of the future, a future in which power, production, and fire would overwhelm even the most experienced pilots. What came next would prove it beyond question. One pilot's survival against impossible odds would forever change how both sides saw the war in the air. June 26, 1943, above Lisieux, France. The sky was bright and clear, the contrails of 50 American bombers stretching in white ribbons across the upper air. Below them, the P-47 Thunderbolts of the 61st Fighter Squadron turned slowly into position, heavy, confident, vigilant. At their rear flew Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, barely 23 years old, in a machine that seemed to roar louder than the wind itself. The mission was routine: escort the bombers home. But nothing in war is ever routine. Without warning, shapes appeared out of the sun, sleek, dark, and fast. 16 Focke-Wulf 190s diving from above, their guns already flashing. They had perfect position. Johnson's world exploded. The first cannon shell struck his Thunderbolt like hammer blows. His canopy shattered. Hydraulic fluid sprayed into his face, blinding him. The engine cowling tore away. The controls went slack. His nose and leg were bleeding, and metal fragments everywhere. He tried to bail out. The canopy wouldn't move. A shell had twisted the frame and jammed the track. He was trapped. At 27,000 feet, bleeding, blinded, and alone, Johnson did the only thing left. He gripped the stick and prayed. The Thunderbolt kept flying. Smoke poured from the engine. The cockpit shook violently. Instruments failed one by one. Yet the massive Pratt and Whitney engine, coughing, sputtering, screaming, refused to quit. Johnson leveled the wings and pointed west toward the channel. Minutes passed like hours. Then another shadow appeared behind him. A single Focke-Wulf 190, its pilot unknown even to history, had followed the crippled American. The German lined up for the kill. The first burst ripped through the P-47 again, cannon shells striking from wingtip to tail. The armor plate behind Johnson's seat clanged under impact, stopping one shell inches from his spine. The next pass came lower. Machine gun rounds tore through the fuselage. Johnson ducked behind his armor plate and waited for death. But when the smoke cleared, the Thunderbolt was still in the air. The German made a third pass. His cannon were empty now. Only his machine guns remained. He closed to point-blank range, raking the P-47 from end to end until his own guns clicked empty. Then, silence. The enemy fighter slid up alongside the shattered American plane. Through the cracked canopy, Johnson could see the German's face, young, blonde, incredulous. For a moment, the two men simply stared at one another across a few yards of open sky. The German pilot raised one gloved hand, a small, almost respectful salute. Then he banked away and disappeared into the clouds. Johnson's P-47 limped on, barely holding altitude, leaking fuel, its control cables half severed. He crossed the French coast and sighted the English shoreline. The landing gear failed to extend, so he came in hard, wheels up, sliding across the field at Manston Airfield until the engine finally quit with a dying groan. When his crew ran to the wreck, they stopped counting bullet holes after 200. 3 of the main fuselage longerons, the structural backbone of the airframe, had been severed. The engine had taken multiple direct hits. The canopy was shattered. Yet somehow the Thunderbolt had not disintegrated. The mechanics said it should have fallen apart in the air. Instead, it had carried its pilot home. The incident spread through every fighter group in England within days. To the Americans, it was proof that they had something extraordinary. To the Germans, it was unthinkable. German intelligence at first dismissed the reports as propaganda. No aircraft could absorb that kind of punishment. But the testimony from their own pilots told the same story. They had watched a Thunderbolt take full cannon bursts and survive. For Robert S. Johnson, it was the day he stopped fearing the Luftwaffe. For the Luftwaffe, it was the day they started fearing the P-47. The official combat report described it in simple language: Aircraft sustained heavy damage, returned to base. But to the men who flew the Thunderbolt, it meant something larger, proof that in the brutal arithmetic of war, weight, power, and armor could mean survival. The flying milk bottle had proven itself the hardest target in the sky. By the time Johnson's photograph appeared in newspapers across America, the transformation had already begun. The laughter that once filled the German radios had gone silent, replaced by something colder. In the months that followed, the Thunderbolt would take that reputation and turn it into a weapon. Robert S. Johnson's shattered Thunderbolt was more than a survivor. It was proof of concept. In hangars across southern England, engineers and pilots gathered around the wreckage, tracing the paths of cannon shells through steel armor and broken cables. They found that the fuselage had been torn apart in 3 places, the tail barely attached. Yet the aircraft had remained flyable. One officer studying the wreck quietly remarked, "We built a tank with wings." He wasn't wrong. That single event rippled through the 8th Air Force. Pilots who had feared their heavy machines began to trust them. Those who had mocked the Thunderbolt's weight learned to use it as a weapon. Major Hub Zemke drilled his men relentlessly. Climb high, dive hard. Hit once, hit to kill. The message was simple. The P-47 didn't have to dance with the enemy. It could crush him. By July 1943, the 56th Fighter Group had refined a new style of combat. Precision-controlled violence. P-47s no longer sought turning fights. They fought from altitude, using gravity as an ally. A full squadron would climb above the bombers, waiting for the Germans to rise. When the enemy appeared, the Thunderbolts would roll over and descend like a meteor storm, each fighter releasing a brief, devastating burst before pulling back into the clouds. The Germans began calling these attacks Thunderbolt dives. But among American pilots, another nickname caught on, the Thunderbolt turkey shoot. During one of these missions in August 1943, Major David Schilling led a flight of 4 P-47s over France. Below, a formation of twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf-110s moved in to strike the American bombers. The German aircraft were heavily armed, their 20mm and 30mm cannons capable of shredding B-17s in seconds. Schilling's flight rolled inverted and dove from 28,000 feet. The Thunderbolts accelerated past 500 mph, faster than any German fighter could follow. The first burst turned a Bf-110 into falling debris. The second tore another apart mid-air. Within a minute, 8 German aircraft were gone, reduced to smoke and fragments. One surviving gunner later told interrogators, "They came down like hammers from heaven. We hit one, but it didn't even wobble. Then it fired, and our plane just came apart." That was the new reality of air combat. German fighters designed for agility were helpless against the Americans' combination of speed, armor, and firepower. By September 1943, reports from Luftwaffe squadrons on the Western Front grew grim. Pilots complained that the Thunderbolt climbed higher than they could reach and dove faster than they dared follow. Its guns, they said, did not fire, they roared. The numbers told the story. American kill ratios began to climb sharply. What had once been 1-3 in the Luftwaffe's favor reversed to 2-1, then 3-1. By winter, some Thunderbolt groups claimed 5 victories for every loss. Then came the death of Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's top aces with over 200 victories. On October 8, 1943, leading a formation against a B-17 group over France, he encountered P-47s of the 56th at 30,000 feet. His FW-190's engine struggled in the thin air while the Thunderbolts, still producing full power through their turbo superchargers, swept in from above. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, the same pilot who had survived the June encounter, spotted Phillips' aircraft. In his after-action report, he wrote simply, "Opened fire at 300 yards. Observed strikes along fuselage. Enemy exploded. No parachute observed." Phillips' death shocked the Luftwaffe. One of their most decorated and experienced aces had been destroyed by a fighter they had once ridiculed. Within the Luftwaffe headquarters, intelligence officers filed a report describing the Thunderbolt's impossible performance at high altitude and extraordinary resilience under fire. That autumn, German morale in the air began to fracture. The skies that had once belonged to them were turning hostile. The psychological shift was unmistakable. Pilots who had once joked about flying milk bottles now spoke of them with visible tension. Radio chatter during encounters revealed fear. When Thunderbolts appeared above 25,000 feet, German formations often broke early, scattering rather than climbing to engage. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe's confidence was gone. American pilots could feel it. The hunted had become the hunters. From that moment, the Thunderbolt wasn't merely a fighter. It was a symbol. It represented the turning tide of the air war, the point where the Luftwaffe's years of experience could no longer compensate for America's power, training, and production. Within months, the balance would tip completely. The Thunderbolt was about to grow deadlier still. Larger propellers, longer range, heavier payloads, transforming from high-altitude guardian to low-level executioner. And when the next phase began, even the ground beneath German soldiers would no longer be safe. By the beginning of 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had become unrecognizable from the aircraft that German pilots once mocked. New versions arriving in England carried larger paddle blade propellers that transformed their climb and acceleration. The modification introduced on the P-47D-22 allowed the fighter to bite into the air with new force. Where earlier Thunderbolts had struggled to climb at just over 2,000 feet per minute, the new propeller pushed that figure past 3,000 feet, a direct match for the Luftwaffe's best. German pilots who once dismissed the big American fighter as a pregnant cow now found it on their tail, climbing effortlessly through the thin air of the upper atmosphere. The change was immediate and devastating. In February 1944, Luftwaffe ace Heinz Knoke encountered one of these new Thunderbolts near Hanover. He expected the usual advantage, his full 190 diving and climbing away with ease. Instead, the American machine stayed with him. They turned into us and climbed with us, Knoke later wrote in his diary. When we tried to disengage, they followed. Schmidt was caught and blown apart. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year. The laughter was gone. The fear had begun. That same month, another change arrived, drop tanks. The Thunderbolt's fuel capacity had always limited its reach, but with twin 108-gallon wing tanks and a 75-gallon belly tank, the aircraft's range stretched past 1,000 miles. For the first time, American fighters could escort bombers all the way to Germany and back. When the 8th Air Force began deep raids into the Reich in early 1944, the Luftwaffe discovered that its last advantage, the sanctuary of distance, had vanished. German formations rising to meet the bombers were intercepted hundreds of miles from home. The skies over Berlin, Leipzig, and Hanover filled with Thunderbolts, and with each passing week, the Americans returned with more. Factories in Farmingdale and Evansville now produced nearly 500 Thunderbolts per month. At the height of production, one aircraft rolled out every 60 minutes. No matter how many the Luftwaffe destroyed, replacements arrived in waves. American logistics ensured spare parts, fresh pilots, and endless fuel. The German Air Force, starved of all three, was collapsing under the sheer weight of attrition. As spring 1944 approached, the Thunderbolt's dominance expanded from the upper air to the ground below. Armed with bombs and rockets, the Jug became a fighter bomber. Without rival, the P-47D-25 could carry two 1,000-pound bombs under its wings and another beneath the fuselage, a bomb, load equal to that of early medium bombers. Later versions added 5-inch high-velocity rockets, each with the explosive power of an artillery shell. To the soldiers of the German army, the sight of a formation of Thunderbolts meant annihilation. Oberst Hans von Luck, a respected panzer commander, described one such encounter during the Normandy campaign. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces. The sound was terrifying. Engines roaring, rockets screaming, and then the hammer of those heavy machine guns. A column of our truck simply ceased to exist. In seconds, 20 vehicles became burning wreckage. We called them Jabos, fighter bombers. But these were more than that. They were flying artillery. The German army began to move only at night. Daylight belonged to the Thunderbolt. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, over 500 P-47s provided cover for the Allied landings in Normandy. From the beaches to the hedgerows, they swept the sky clean of German aircraft. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer, one of the few Luftwaffe pilots to reach the invasion zone, later recalled, "The sky belonged to the Americans." The Thunderbolts were everywhere, from sea level to the clouds. We tried to break through at dawn. 12 of us left. I was the only one to return. In the following weeks, the Thunderbolt's firepower turned retreat into disaster. In June alone, 9th Air Force Thunderbolts destroyed over 3,800 trucks, 500 armored vehicles, and 650 locomotives. German supply lines disintegrated. Bridges collapsed. Columns burned. What the bombers missed, the Thunderbolts finished. The weapon once laughed at for its bulk had become the embodiment of Allied air supremacy. Its roar, that deep rolling thunder, echoed over every battlefield from Normandy to the Rhine. And as the Luftwaffe weakened further, the Thunderbolt's dominance would expand even beyond Europe. By the end of summer 1944, the Thunderbolt was no longer just a fighter. It was the most feared weapon in the German arsenal. To the men on the ground, its low, thundering roar meant death was moments away. To the pilots above, it meant command of the skies. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was disintegrating under the weight of American production. Fuel was scarce. Training hours had been slashed to almost nothing. Many new German pilots entered combat with less than 100 total flight hours, facing Americans who had logged 4 times that before their first mission. The difference showed. While Luftwaffe squadrons struggled to assemble a dozen aircraft, the Thunderbolt groups of the 9th Air Force could launch hundreds in a single morning. By autumn 1944, the German airfields themselves became targets, the P-47s attacking hangars, runways, and fuel depots at treetop height. When Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's desperate New Year's Day offensive, struck Allied airfields on January 1, 1945, the Germans briefly succeeded in destroying dozens of parked aircraft, including 22 Thunderbolts. But within 48 hours, replacements had landed from England. A German pilot captured after the raid pointed at the smoking wrecks and sneered, "What do you think of that?" Major George Brooking, commanding officer of the 365th Fighter Group, replied quietly, "By tomorrow we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" It was not bravado, and it was fact. The Luftwaffe lost over 270 aircraft and 200 pilots that day. The Americans replaced every lost P-47 within a week. Germany never recovered. Even as it devastated Europe, the Thunderbolt proved equally potent in the Pacific. The vast distances of that theater tested every aircraft's endurance, but the P-47 adapted again. The P-47N, built with extended wet wings carrying 93 gallons of fuel each, could fly over 2,300 miles, long enough to escort B-29 superfortresses all the way to Japan. In the hands of Colonel Neil Kirby and the 348th Fighter Group, the P-47 became a giant killer. On October 11, 1943, Kirby led 4 Thunderbolts against 40 Japanese fighters over Wewak, New Guinea. 6 enemy aircraft fell to his guns in minutes, earning him the Medal of Honor. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who later faced the P-47, described it bluntly. "We called them monsters. Our cannon could tear apart a P-40, but against the Thunderbolt they did nothing. I fired dozens of shells into one and it kept flying. Their return fire was like a storm of stones. One burst and you were gone. Whether over Europe's farmland or the jungles of the Pacific, the result was the same. The Thunderbolt endured, struck back and dominated. As 1945 dawned, newer aircraft, the long-range P-51 Mustang and the first American jets, began to take over the escort missions. But the P-47 did not fade away. It evolved into the role it had perfected: ground attack. Flying low, its pilots strafed convoys, destroyed tanks, and turned German retreat into chaos. The roar of 8 Brownings was followed by explosions as rockets and bombs tore apart everything on the roads below. By war's end, the statistics spoke for themselves. In Europe alone, Thunderbolt units destroyed over 6,000 enemy aircraft, 86,000 railway cars, and 68,000 trucks. More than 213,000 combat sorties were flown. The Thunderbolt achieved a 4.6-to-1 kill ratio in air combat while maintaining the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter bomber. Each figure represented not just machinery, but a philosophy, the idea that power, protection, and production could win wars more effectively than finesse. When the Luftwaffe finally ceased to exist in April 1945, its surviving pilots admitted what had long been clear. They hadn't been defeated by superior tactics or faster aircraft. They'd been crushed by an enemy that could outbuild, outtrain, and outlast them, captured Ace Joseph Priller. The same man who had once mocked the Thunderbolt as a flying cow summarized it best. They lose 10 and build 20. We lose one and it's gone forever. They have fuel, training, and replacements. We have courage, and courage alone can't win a war. From laughter to fear, from arrogance to awe, the transformation was complete. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once a symbol of American excess, had become the weapon that shattered the Luftwaffe and changed the air war forever. Its deep, rolling sound became a warning in every German heart. The thunder was coming and there was nowhere left to hide. In the end, the P-47 Thunderbolt was more than metal and engine noise. It was a statement, a roar of industrial confidence echoing across the sky. Where early war aircraft had been built by craftsmen, the Thunderbolt was built by a nation. Each rivet carried the weight of American assembly lines, of women riveting in Long Island hangars, of men who had never seen Europe but whose hands shaped its liberation. It represented the shift from the age of aces to the age of systems, from lone duels to coordinated power. No longer did victory belong to the most agile or the most daring. It belonged to the machine that could fight, return, and fly again the next morning, multiplied by thousands. The Germans, who had once laughed, learned that lesson the hardest way. They had built beautiful aircraft, but beauty alone could not withstand fire. The Thunderbolt was proof that survival was its own kind of grace, a brutal industrial grace that left the enemy powerless. Even among the men who flew it, awe replaced fear. Pilots climbed into the cockpit knowing they were surrounded by armor, horsepower, and history. Many called it ugly, but to those who owed their lives to its strength, it was the most beautiful sound on earth, that deep radial thunder rolling across the clouds, a promise that they would make it home. By war's end, sleeker designs like the P-51 Mustang and the jet-powered Me-262 would capture the headlines. Yet the Thunderbolt remained the unsung foundation of Allied air power, the workhorse that never failed, the giant that laughed last. Its legacy is not in speed or elegance, but in endurance. In the faith that raw power, discipline, and resilience can overcome anything, even a world that once thought you were too heavy to fly. In that sense, the P-47's roar still carries a message across history's sky, that sometimes the most unstoppable force is the one everyone first underestimates.